certainly someone who has a material evidence that would hurt Harry Chris, who by this time is no longer living, because the conversation that we're talking about took place between Losey and the assistant district attorney, whose name was O'Neill. That conversation took place on January 13th. And the subsequent conversation in which Pagones told O'Neill about a girl in a bag of feces, in which Harry Chris inquired about on November 28th, occurred on January 14th. So here you already have a situation where facts are developing that would make Stephen Pagones a suspect. Now, a lot of this information was never known to the public. The notion of Pagones saying that Harry Chris asked about a girl in a bag of feces, that only came about in a grand jury report on October 6th. So that's many months after Pagones had had this conversation. So the public from January to October never knew about a girl in a bag of feces. The other thing that people did not know is that after all of this information came out quietly and secretly, that the FBI began to conduct an investigation of Pagones and to see what involvement that he had in the case. Now, nobody never knew this, Mr. Brown. And this is what is interesting, because that investigation started on January 19th, and that was one day before Grady was disqualified as the district attorney in the investigation of the Tawana Brawley matter. So the FBI goes to Pagones. The FBI agent's name was Hilda Kogut. She has a meeting with Pagones. She tells him, then we want to talk about your involvement possibly in Brawley and in the death of Harry Chris. Pagones said, I'm not saying nothing to you, and unless I have a lawyer present. Now, here's a man who claims up until this day that he's innocent, but on this date, he refused to say anything to the FBI, which is already involved in a civil rights investigation of the Tawana Brawley matter. And so what you have here is Stephen Pagones, at that time, unbeknownst to the public, is already a suspect. Judge Hillary testifies that she wrote a letter to the governor after both Grady and Saul was disqualified, because Saul replaced Grady. But within 24 hours after Saul was appointed, he also sought disqualification because he found out that the investigation would go into the district attorney's office itself for a possible cover-up. And so Saul, therefore, under those circumstances, said, look, I can't investigate this case because no attorney in Dutchess County can investigate this case, because you can't have cases with the district attorney's office while simultaneously investigating that office. So they were all disqualified. Here you have Stephen Pagones contacted on February 11th by the FBI. And the FBI tells him at that particular time that we want to talk to you. He says you have to talk to my counsel, who by that time was Gerald Hayes. And Mr. Hayes said, we're not going to cooperate with you. They asked Mr. Hayes, will Mr. Pagones submit to a polygraph? Would he take a lie detector? They said, absolutely not. So when people talk about why don't Tawana talk, nobody never asked why didn't Steve Pagones talk, because nobody even knew that he was being investigated by local law enforcement officials as well as federal law enforcement officials. All of this was hush-hush, because if you remember, when Grady disqualified himself, he refused to specify the reason for the disqualification. He said that there's an unspecified conflict of interest, but I will not disclose it. Now, you know, any time that government keeps things secret, I mean, that creates more of an interest in what has occurred. So here you have, in February, Stephen Pagones not cooperating with the FBI, not cooperating with anybody. Now, this is a telling date. On March 4th, and remember now, at this particular time, Maddox, Mason, and Sharpton, nor Tawana Brawley has called Stephen Pagones' name. This is March 4th. Nobody calls his name. He's not the subject of any public accusation by Maddox, Mason, Sharpton, and Brawley. The only thing that he's been subjected to is a secret investigation done by the FBI as well as local law enforcement officials. But what does he do? He goes to the doctor on March 4th. And what does he tell the doctor? He says, "Doctor, I'm involved in a highly controversial case." He doesn't say what the case is at that time, although he later admits that it was Tawana Brawley. And the doctor says, "Well, Mr. Pagones, how long have you had this stress, this nervous condition?" And he says 3 months. Now this is March 4th, 1988. Everybody pull out their calendars and go back 3 months. His stress started at the death of Harry Chris. Now, that's very interesting because he has distanced himself from Harry Chris by saying that I was not a friend of Harry Chris, I was only friendly with him. All right? Now, why would Harry Chris' death cause all of this stress that he claims that he's now under on March 4th? All of this burning sensation in his stomach that he's suffering from on March 4th, why would this stress have gone all the way back to December 2nd? Now, what we do know is that on November 28th, the day that Tawana Brawley was found and the day that Tommy Young, a police officer in Poughkeepsie, interviewed Tawana Brawley, we know that on that date, while Stephen Pagones and Harry Chris was in an automobile, supposedly en route to or from Danbury, Connecticut, supposedly doing Christmas shopping, Harry Chris pulled out a gun and threatened to blow Stephen Pagones' brains out. A .357 Magnum. Now, I will submit that anybody put a gun to your head and threaten to blow your brains out, all right, you got one of three options later if you are able to tell your story. Option one, you can go to the police and report it and hope that they will apprehend this person so that you will no longer be subjected to it. Option two, you leave the county, you leave the state, you get as far away from this person as possible because you know the next time this person is going to fulfill on his promise. Option three is you knock the person off. Well, Mr. Pagones did not report this to the police, and he did not leave the county. And Harry Chris ended up dead. So I think that you at least have to begin to conclude that Mr. Pagones may know a little bit more about Harry Chris' death than he's letting on. In addition to that, he slipped during his deposition and admitted that the night before Harry Chris was found, he was in the company of Harry Chris. Now, that slip of the tongue by him is contrary to the testimony in the grand jury report that was issued by Robert Abrams, the New York State Attorney General, on October 6th, because Robert Abrams in that report said that the last person to see see Harry Chris was Harry Chris' girlfriend, and they had a conversation about 9:30 or so that evening. And according to that theory, he must have killed himself or knocked himself out right after that. But here you have Mr. Pagones admitting in a deposition that the night before, the same night he was on the phone to his girlfriend, that he was actually in the company of Harry Chris. Now, when we get to trial, we finally get the autopsy report. And as you know, all of the hoopaloo was on the fact that Harry Chris died as a result of a suicide. He shot himself. Well, we got the autopsy report, and the autopsy report said there's no evidence of a suicide. There's no evidence of a self-inflicted wound. This autopsy report had been hidden from the public for 10 years. We've been trying to get it for all that time. And finally, the autopsy report says, no, there's no suicide here. So what do? We don't just rest with the autopsy report. We called in the pathologist who filled out the autopsy report, Dr. Alexander J. Aplaska. And Dr. Aplaska testified that he could not make the leap from his Harry Chris death to a suicide. Because you see, there are certain telltale signs that have to exist if there's a suicide. I mean, you can kill yourself, but that you don't take the weapon with you. You don't clean your hands of the gunpowder residue that will be left behind if, in fact, this is what has been done. None of that is removed because you're supposed to be dead. But what happened? They claimed that was a suicide note. Well, Dr. Plasker said, I never saw a suicide note. I was the pathologist. I was conducting the cause of his death and the manner of his death, but nobody ever showed me a suicide note. A gun? Nobody gave me a gun. I don't know what he was shot with. Crime scene photos which show the position of the body and other circumstances that would help in forming an opinion as to a suicide or not. He said, no, I was never given any crime scene photos. Gunpowder residue on the hands of Harry Chris, because if you fire a weapon, the weapon itself emits a lot of gases, and gunpowder residue fall on your hand. I mean, that's a matter of fact. And so that gunpowder residue can be seen by the naked eye or through microscopic examination. And Dr. Plasker said, A, I don't know whether he was left-handed or right-handed, but B, and more important, I never saw any gunpowder residue on his hands. And I didn't conduct a microscopic examination of his hands, so as far as I know, there was no gunpowder residue, which is very critical in determining a suicide or not. I mean, that would be something that you would do if you were really trying to establish whether it was suicide or not. But here you have Dr. Plasker saying, no, I can't make that leap. I can't do that. Well, now, given the fact that here you have the pathologist who examined the body and who said that I can't say there was a suicide, and in fact my autopsy report does not reflect a suicide. All right, you would have imagined that if Robert Abrams, who had been appointed as a special prosecutor to replace Grady and Saul, he was the New York State Attorney General, you would have expected that he would have put Dr. Plasker into the grand jury that he had convened, because he's probably looking for the truth. Well, I asked Dr. Plasker on the witness stand, Doctor, did you ever testify before any grand jury? No. You didn't testify before the Grady grand jury, the first grand jury? No, I didn't. Did you testify before Mr. Abrams' grand jury? No, I didn't testify before Mr. Abrams' grand jury either. Well, did there ever come a time when Mr. Abrams contacted you? No, he never contacted me. Well, if you read the grand jury report of Dr. Plasker, you will notice that there was a Dr. Michael Biden who appeared before the grand jury, or the Abrams grand jury that is, and said that this death of Harry Chris was a suicide. It was not a murder. It wasn't even close. Did Dr. Biden talk to you before he went and rendered that opinion before the grand jury? Dr. Plasker said no, he didn't. Well, did he examine the body? Was the body ever exhumed? No, not to my knowledge. Well, during the time that you were examining the body, was Dr. Biden there? No, he wasn't there. Well, why would Mr. Abrams spend all of this money to bring in somebody who has no personal knowledge of the body of Harry Chris to render an opinion? Because he sought to discredit everything that Maddox, Mason, and Sharpton said.